Hello everyone, this is part 43 of What If Naruto Was Like the Sage of 6 Parts, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Conan exploded into thousands of sheets of paper, each moving in random, evasive ways as she scattered back from an explosive kick from the young mint-haired girl that left a sizable crater in the roof below them. Conan was slightly disconcerted with the girl's speed and strength, simply unnatural for a girl her size and age. She wondered if this was the influence of the girl's Bayou, but she hadn't yet seen any sign of its presence. That too was strange, as with all the reports they had gathered from Black Zetsu, the girl was described as using her tenant's chakra almost liberally. Right now Conan would have preferred that, then she could simply distract the girl with paper clones and diversionary tactics until she ran out of energy or was too injured from her Bijuu's chakra. However, as the papers that made up her body scurried out of the way of another vicious of the girl's surprisingly dangerous water swords, Conan didn't think that was likely to happen any time soon. A smirk crossed the older woman's face though as she floated back, forcing Fu to jump across a street-wide gap to land on the adjacent building. However, mid-roll her orange eyes opened wider in surprise as the very floor she was standing on suddenly came alive as exploding tags that had previously been camouflaged against the tiles snapped up to try and surround her body. Conan forced down the smirk as she watched the explosion that completely leveled the building rise high into the sky from above it, keeping a wary amber eye for any sign of movement. It was only this vigilance that allowed her to quickly spin her body to the side, using her papery wings to propel herself away as a small shadow descended on her from above. True to her previous nature as an ruthlessly trained Kei-Fu dropped down on the just barely aware Akatsuki without a whisper of sound. As she landed in a tight roll on another building, cautious for more traps, both women took a moment to take stock of the situation, knowing right now they were just going in circles with one another. Those shadow clones are a rather irritating ability, I must admit. It was mostly due to the fact they were indistinguishable from the original, meaning even the mint-haired girl she was talking to now could simply be another clone. They have their uses. At least Conan could respect the mindset of the teen she was fighting. Like her, she was level-headed in conflict. Also like her, she was the faithful companion of a Rinnegan user. The parallels were actually rather disturbing when looked at too deeply, so the Bluenet didn't. Are you not going to ask me my motives? Try to convince me that what I am doing is wrong. From what I understand, that is what your group tends to do, is it not? Fuu's gaze remained level as she kept her senses on alert for any underhanded tactics. The woman was a shinobi after all. I am not Naruto. I am more than willing to do the things he purposefully limits himself from doing if it means keeping him safe. Briefly, a spark of true respect alighted in Conan's eyes before she quashed it with the rest of her emotion, setting her mind instead to the task of just what Fu was buying time for with all these clones. Something that took this long to prepare would either be very powerful, or the girl was accounting for as many tactical possibilities as possible in whatever trap she was preparing. I can admire your commitment, but I must also be faithful to my own. Pain's wishes are my own. Faster than Fu could react, the papers around Conan's hand swirled, coiling tightly into a long and viciously tipped spear that the woman instantly threw. The former Jinchuriki had no chance against the spear propelled by both Conan's strength and her chakra-enhanced paper. It struck her right through the shoulder, only missing her heart thanks to what reflexes Fu could actually muster. She just wasn't able to compare to Conan's more honed speed thanks to the woman's age. However, only moments later the girl smirked lightly, her job done as she burst into a cloud of clean white smoke. Thank you for giving me time for this. I never was as good as the others at it. The paper user spun in the air, latching onto the new voice until she spotted another Fu standing on a nearby rooftop. Conan wasn't sure how she knew, but this one was definitely no clone. She just seemed different, even if it was hard to put a finger on why. Paper swirled violently around her hand again, this time into a large windmill shuriken, but she launched it with that same speed like she had predicted. Fu leapt up and over the slightly slower moving projectile. However, Conan allowed herself a brief smirk as a second shuriken revealed itself in the shadow of the first. Her lips almost immediately turned down though when instead of the expected sound of F being C open there was only a dull tap. Fu had reached out in midair and caught the razor-sharp edge of the paper weapon so quickly it didn't even reach her palm. Not only this, but she managed to do it all without actually looking up once, and Conan quickly understood why when she finally saw the girl's eyes. They practically glowed with the ominous color of molten gold. You possess a form of sage mode like Jiraiya-sensei. Almost as if to punctuate that statement, both women felt the tremors behind them as in the distance an enormous toad buried its equally large sword into the ground in an attempt to deal with one of Pain's summons. True to her words though, Fu had undergone a slight change beyond the change to her eyes. Two thick red lines traced the edges of her nose on both sides before curving around beneath her eyes, following the contours of her face down her cheekbones and tailing off into elegant flicks on her N. The space around and above her eyes had also turned the same red, heightening the much more exotic appearance of her eyes. One moment Fu was looking up at her with those intense yellow eyes, the next she blurred out of view, appearing not even a moment later in front of the woman, hand drawn back and crackling with lightning chakra. However, Conan realized it was a diversion too late as he brought a few of her papers around as a makeshift shield. The younger girl twisted her body in a way many wouldn't have considered possible, using her now downward momentum to bring her foot up and over the Akatsuki member and swiftly bring it down in a senjutsu-enhanced axe kick. The two separated again, Conan reeling from the brutal attack and Fu managing to gracefully flip back onto the street. However, at the same instant her foot touched the ground, it once again came alive as hundreds of sheets of paper latched onto her. She couldn't even jump away as the little white sheets secured her to the floor, allowing more and more to flock onto her body until she was entirely encased in paper like some strange makeshift statue in the middle of the street. The vedette tried in vain to flex her muscles and move even a little, even as she felt her oxygen slowly running out, but the almost concrete hard papers offered no leverage whatsoever, preventing her from bringing her nature chakra-enhanced strength into play. Hundreds of little origami birds flocked together in the street in front of the immobilized girl, quickly forming Conan's body, or at least half of it as the woman chose to hover a few feet off the ground, her wings spread out to either side like the angel Omegacore considered her to be. She made an almost absent gesture to call in more papers to finish capturing the girl. The only thing to do now was to wait for the girl to pass out from oxygen deprivation. However, the woman was caught off guard as two green constructs suddenly burst from the paper cocoon, through the reinforced sheets like they were tissue paper. The two insectoid wings buzzed experimentally once before moving in a flurry of frenzied action, using their razored edges to neatly through the girl's confines. A moment later and Fu was free again, taking in large, thankful gulps of air as her new wings buzzed excitedly behind her, sometimes spasmodically as if they were unsure of what they should be doing. After a moment both women got their bearings, returning to glaring at one another as the newly winged Fu began experimental flapping her wings. Unfortunately for her, without the nanabe at least partially controlling the appendages, she found it much more difficult than normal. The only reason she had even this much control was purely prior experience, not to mention the sheer concentration it took to maintain them, even with senjutsu giving her more focus. Those little wings will not help you here, girl. Fu ignored her, knowing that if it came to a battle of air supremacy the much more experienced Akatsuki member would likely have the advantage. Instead she flashed through a set of long hand signs, already jumping back and using her new wings for a small boost to prevent Conan from stopping her. Naturally the blue-haired woman raised her hand, calling forth a veritable stream of razor-thin papers to flood the girl, going for Quenny to try and overwhelm the girl's newfound power-up. Still, she couldn't help but raise an eyebrow as the first light patterings of rain began to fall around her, sliding harmlessly off her body. From the look in her opponent's eyes she could tell this was the result of the girl's jutsu, a smart move, but Conan was long beyond that weakness. Rain. You believe water will help you here? Conan's eyes hardened, actually feeling herself a little insulted. Her enemy had at least proved herself to be intelligent and forward-thinking. I believe the time has come for me to stop playing around. The previously bulky paper wings on Conan's back seemed to compress for a moment, becoming thinner and more like those of an angel, with defined feathers even. Shikigami no Mai. The two wings took one powerful backstroke, creating a large wall of pressure that shattered windows behind the woman and launched her forward, just a white and blue blur. Even Fu's sage-enhanced sense couldn't keep up with the veritable bullet of a woman as she flew past, creating another shockwave as he fist met Fu's stomach. There was no reprieve though, as when Fu looked down she saw a single sheet of blue paper latched onto her sea. In mere moments she was completely surrounded by what could only be described as a tornado of paper. It reached into the sky, dwarfing some of the summons around it as the thousands of sheets that composed it did their work, S&C into the sage-enhanced girl. Each one was nothing more than a shallow, thin sea, but there were so many, from every direction, that Fu just couldn't keep up with them all. From above, Conan cancelled her technique, allowing the papers to disperse and seemingly vanish when in fact she had them lie in wait in case the girl was not defeated yet. The rain around them had stopped, no doubt from the former Jinchuriki losing her focus, and the bluenet used that as her cue to descend on the girl, gracefully hanging in the air before her opponent. Fu felt as bad as she looked, covered in B from the hundreds or thousands of sea that littered her body. Slowly the red marks around her eyes faded and the irises returned to their normal orange. However, as her would-be captor approached she couldn't help but smile, eliciting a small pause from Conan as she suspected a trap. "You're..." Conan frowned at the weak voice, approaching a little closer so she could hear the girl's strained whisper, that smile infuriating her to no end. "I knew you were from Omegacore." Fu just about managed to get that out, feeling faint from being lost but managing to keep herself together long enough to do what she needed. Conan pondered the strange phrase for a moment, trying to work out the girl's final taunt, only for her eyes to open wider in realization. If the girl had known she was from Am, then why use a technique to simulate rain? Unless... Katsu. Conan looked up far too late to see Fu's hands weakly clasped in the tiger seal, the thousands of tiny glittering specks across her body that had been carried onto her by each individual raindrop glowing and hissing ominously. Quickly, triage procedures everybody, come on. Sunad huffed, blowing a stray strand of her long blonde hair away from her eyes as she glanced around the makeshift medical area. Naturally, the hospital was a prime spot for attacks during the invasion, so this area had been set up as quickly as possible to deal with the sudden influx of injured or incapacitated shinobi. Around her the medical ninja scurried about, prioritizing and treating patients the best they could while an entire company of Anbu stood vigilantly nearby as guards. Her head flashed up as the ground beneath her rocked slightly, a warm gust of air blowing past her as the surrounding ninja steadied themselves. In the near distance a small plume of flame rose into the sky before petering out, just a rain of dust and smoke to mark the explosion. Sunad quickly put it out of her mind despite the strange nagging sensation she was feeling and concentrated at the task at hand as she looked back down at the unconscious body in front of her. Damn it, Kakashi, just what did this to you? The elite Junin was in a tenuous situation, suffering from severe chakra depletion as well as B loss from the multiple impalements. She was still making efforts just to remove the strange black rods and not send the poor man into shock. Momentarily she felt a flutter of worry for her idiot of a teammate but quashed it, knowing Jiraiya was strong enough to handle himself here. However, as she looked up to see a small sandstorm raging in what appeared to be the center of the village, she knew who it was she was really worried for. Pain missed the small flash of a smirk crossing Naruto's face before the Gakido was sent hurtling back through the wall behind the blonde and three more in its path. The only indication Naruto had done anything was the palm he had facing towards the larger puppet. If Pain was surprised by the wordless Shinra Tensei, though he certainly didn't show it, his paths instead moving to try and surround the blonde only for said monk to chuckle lightly. The civilians have finished evacuating. He could feel it through his water sense. The only signatures anywhere in the near vicinity were higher-leveled ones like Anbu. He had wondered why no Konoha shinobi had intervened in their fight yet, but he presumed between protecting their injured Kage, fending off the giant summons, and making sure the genin weren't placing themselves in immediate danger, the village ultimately had its hands full. After all, Konoha was not expecting the attack, so a large portion of its forces were out on missions or in the surrounding regions on patrol, too far away to be of any help. Good. Naruto flexed his hand, the sand around his feet twitching as if called, that means I don't have to worry about them anymore. The sand began to whirl more violently as the five paths in front of him eyed him carefully, trying to prepare for whatever was about to happen. However, as the sand blasted outward, swirling in a maelstrom of tiny, grating particles, they could do nothing but raise their arms to shade their eyes. One of them noticed that around them the walls were being noticeably ground away by the furiously swirling sandstorm, eliciting all of them to jump up to try and escape the unnatural phenomena. They missed it then, with their obscured lines of sight, when thick black chains simply appeared before them from nowhere, instantly impaling 3 of the paths before any of them knew quite what was happening. Internally all of the pains scowled as one of them, the pain with the squared jaw and spiky hair, was speared straight through the head, instantly making the puppet inoperable. Naruto had undermined a large portion of their strategy without even realizing, not to mention taking out Chikushodo and Ninjendo in the same attack, effectively halving Pain's numbers. At the same time though it allowed him to divert more chakra into the remaining 3, strengthening him enough that Tendu was able to bat the chain aside and Shuradu was able to separate his torso from his legs by a long metal cable, dodging the chain. Both grabbed their respective chains in unison, pulling them forward and grabbing the end of the invisible Naruto clones behind them before mercilessly crushing them into smoke. Tendu grunted in mild annoyance as he looked around fruitlessly, unable to see anything at all within the localized sandstorm, and despite the body's inability to feel pain he knew that slowly the skin was being ground away at, limiting its capability. He raised a hand, blowing back a massive portion of the sand to try and clear his vision, incidentally leveling a nearby building beneath his notice. His eyes widened though in visible surprise as a shadow descended over him, growing alarmingly in size as he looked up to see an arm-like structure of sand coming down to flatten him. Banshu Tenon. The orange-haired Akatsuki suddenly flew out of the way of the arm, his body jerking unnaturally as he was attracted to a nearby structure that trembled as the sand arm crushed the ground behind him. He flipped and landed feet first on the wall, cratering it from the impact before standing there horizontally, calmly looking for any sign of his blonde-haired opponent. He was lucky Shurado had survived the O of the chains, as not a moment later the Asura path using bald Akatsuki managed to catch a beam of pure white energy in their shared vision that Pain recognized all too well. A crushing impact in front of him from Gakido falling from the sky saved him though, as the larger puppet opened its arms out wide, absorbing all of the chakra from the blast as all 3 Pains looked towards its obvious source. It made Naruto narrow his eyes slightly as his arm disassembled and reassembled itself back into a normal hand again. He quickly raised a palm, blocking a series of powerful explosions above him with an invisible wall of force, still feeling the intense heat from the small but dangerous projectiles launched from Shuradu's arm. Not a moment later Gakido came barreling out of the smoke, dodging the chains and sand. Naruto centered him with far more speed and agility than it had shown before. The 2 locked hands as a look of small satisfaction crossed the orange-haired puppet's face, only for it to drop as it felt nothing happening. When it tried to draw out chakra from the younger blonde it felt some kind of resistance. Its eyes only opened wider in alarm when it felt its own chakra slowly begin to get drawn out against its will. Realizing the situation it tried to use what it assumed to be its greater strength to throw the boy closer to the other Pains, only to find itself unable to move. Naruto quickly overpowered the much larger man thanks to the strength he had inherited from Tsunade, holding him there as he locked eyes with the puppet, making sure that wherever the real Pain was he could see him clearly. These are nothing more than empty puppets with a poor facsimile of our power, as long as you hide behind them you won't beat me. A third arm grew out of the monk's shoulder, quickly reconstructing itself into an awfully familiar and complicated tube-like shape before it glowed a bright blue, and Pain saw nothing else from that path. Naruto allowed the now headless puppet to slump to the side, a little sickened by the fact he had just had to witness a grown man have his head completely disintegrated by a blast of concentrated chakra. Their fight had moved towards the edges of the village now, towards the cliff that bore the Hokage monument, and Naruto could clearly see the path of destruction it had wrought through the streets. He didn't get time to look for very long before a wall of sand sprung up beside him, blocking off a sharp metal tail that was trying to bisect his body. He jumped back from the flurry of mechanical fists that tried to further the damage, only to swing through air. Moments later Shuradu found itself surrounded on both sides by 2 Naruto clones that had seemingly phased out of thin air, both with their hands towards it and their eyes cold. Shinra Tensei. However, before the rippling waves of force could rend the mechanical path apart or crush it flat, its body was violently yanked away, as if he had been plucked by some great invisible string. The 2 clones, in their surprise, were not fast enough to dodge the 2 chakra rods that swiftly implanted in their end, courtesy of Tendu, leaving Naruto standing alone against the 2 Pains. At that moment though a great blast rippled through the village, causing Naruto to look over to where a great plume of fire and smoke was reaching towards the sky. Pain quickly saw his opportunity as Shurado crouched down, the top of its head seemingly unfolding to reveal a strange metallic hole that seemed unsettlingly similar to the chakra cannon Naruto could manifest in his arm, only bigger. He was proved right as the puppet's head began to glow blindingly bright before an enormous blast of energy roared out of the weapon. The ground underneath its path was torn asunder as windows that had somehow survived the previous shattered completely. Naruto literally had no time other than to raise his arm, his eyes wide with the sheer magnitude of the blast, to proportions he had never even tried, even in Sage mode. As the puppets were being whittled down and Pain's chakra was distributed more evenly, they each became more and more dangerous. So blinded by the corona of pure energy engulfing his view, even as he drained it into himself, he missed Tendu raise his hand, his eyes rippling with energy. Shinra Tensei. Shuradu never stopped firing, not giving Naruto time to mount a defense as the poor monk was hit full force with the catastrophic attack, lifting him up and sending him careening through the air. He desperately tried to right himself, but he was too disoriented from the wave of force to think clearly. He had even managed to reinforce his skin with Doton chakra and the Asura path, but it still felt like being hit with a truck, or one of Suin's untempered punches. He rolled painfully to a stop after crashing through more than a few trees, now well on the outskirts of Konoha, to the point where the surrounding forest completely hid the village from his view. A tree next to him exploded as Shuradu made its presence known, blasting into the clearing with what appeared to be jets of flame roaring out of its feet for propulsion. Naruto managed to skirt out of the way and attempted to punch the flying path, but only succeeded in getting one of his arms caught. In a sudden feat of strength though, Naruto whirled, using his more stable footing as a pivot to throw the mechanical Akatsuki member into a nearby cliff face, off two of its arms in the process. Before any respite could be had though, his eyes widened as his passive water sense informed him of the nearby danger, allowing him to lean back to avoid being ruthlessly by another chakra rod. His hand came up at the same moment as Tendu's, both of them widening their eyes slightly as their hands pointed at one another, only inches apart, the invisible gravitational forces already unleashed. Kaiten, Enden. Jiraiya kept his fingers in front of him as he exhaled a sudden stream of burning hot flames that quickly combined with the enormous stream of oil that Gamabunta was providing. They combined in the air to produce a roaring inferno that quickly engulfed the unbelievably huge rhinoceros that had been charging them down. The pitiful creature roared in vain for a few moments as it burned, unable to quench the oil-driven flames as it wreathed on the ground before finally sucking to its injuries and bursting into smoke. The white-haired toad sage wiped his brow from having to perform 3 high-level summoning techniques as well as all these combination techniques. It was almost as if his age were beginning to catch up with him. He quickly laughed off his own concerns before steadying himself as yet another large explosion swept past him, the displaced air causing a few windows to rattle and his hair to move. This time though the blast seemed to come from much further away, outside of the village itself, which made him look around. Sure enough, in the forest just to the side of the Hokage mountain, at the base of a particularly large hill, a plume of smoke rose from what appeared to be a newly created clearing. It was too far away for him to try and tell just what was going on, but he left it to the shinobi that were closer. Right now he had a job to do. The summons that had been harassing the village were finally staying for whatever reason, as opposed to being replaced almost as soon as they were destroyed, and Jiraiya was taking the opportunity to deal with them quickly and efficiently. He had received word that Hiruzen was badly injured, so in essence he was the highest ranked shinobi that was able to coordinate the village's efforts. Still, he couldn't fight off the mild nagging feeling he had at the back of his mind that something was wrong. Naruto groaned lightly as he pried himself out of a particularly large tree trunk his body had managed to embed itself into. His recollection of the last few moments seemed a little muddled, but he at least knew that the use of 2 very high-level gravity manipulation techniques that closed together was just a terrible idea. He dropped to the ground, having to take a knee to clear his swimming head. Unfortunately for him, his opponent suffered no such restrictions of pain, rather ironically. Sure enough, Tendu emerged from the trees, covering some parts of his body and much of his Akatsuki robe torn to shreds but otherwise still in one shape. You have fought well, Naruto Uzumaki, as only to be expected from a bearer of the Rinnegan. You had the potential for a great deal of things, but ultimately you chose to stand against my vision of peace, and now you pay for it, kneeling before me. Naruto let out a cynical laugh as he struggled to his feet again, his legs still a little shaky as he did his best to heal the damage that impact had done to him. I'm not done yet. He managed to push off his knee and stand firmly on his feet, glaring back defiantly at the stoic expression of the sole remaining body of pain. No, this ends here, now. You were right when you said these puppet be of mine are mere facsimiles of the true power we possess as successors to the sage. However, Tendu suddenly clasped his hands together and Naruto was able to witness a positively enormous amount of chakra swirl between them, growing and compressing, becoming more and more dense until it became almost blinding to look at with his chakra-sensitive eyes. With just this body left, those restrictions are far looser. When the spiky-haired man opened his hands again, a tiny little black ball floated between them before suddenly flying out of his hands and taking to the sky, pulsating almost excitedly. Be honored that you would force me to go this far. Naruto's eyes widened in surprise and fear as the ground around him began to crack and shake, all the while Pain stared on him passively. Chibaku Tensei. It was chaotic. The ground and everything else around Naruto was being held out of the earth, towards the pulsating black sphere that had quickly been covered by an increasingly thick layer of, well, everything. Trees, rocks, even massive chunks of the ground itself were pulled into the air and mercilessly crushed against the small singularity that only seemed to grow more powerful with each passing moment. As soon as Naruto felt his feet begun to leave the ground, his eyes widened, chains shot out of his back to anchor him to the ground on nothing more than an instinctual self-preservation instinct. Tendu Pain just stood there, seemingly unaffected by the enormity of his own technique as the ground around him began to buckle and contort between two conflicting gravitational fields. Desperately Naruto raised a hand, not even bothering to say the name of the technique as he silently willed himself closer to the earth. However, all he achieved was some slack on the chains, which was only disrupted a moment later when even the ground he was anchoring himself onto began to feel the draw of the miniature planetary body in the making. It is useless now, Uzumaki. This is the sage's strongest technique, the one he himself used to place the moon in the sky. There is no escape now, only capture. I'm sure you will live though. With that seemingly final remark, Naruto felt the ground beneath him finally give, a huge slab of it slowly rising into the air and taking his with it, still dangling from his chains. He released them, finding no use in securing himself to a piece of earth that was actually rising faster than him. Instead he set his sights on the body of Pain still watching him impassively. Surely if that was destroyed then it would disrupt the technique. Kaiten. Naruto brought his hands around his mouth like a funnel, fanning and heating his chakra until he could blow out a white-hot steam of much more concentrated flame than last time. However, as an unfortunate side effect of his brash thinking, the attempted attack only succeeded in propelling himself closer to the sphere still growing in the sky. Pain himself was able to dash out of the way of the powerful, but ineffective stream of flames in a flicker of motion. Naruto attempted to right himself in the air by sending out tens of chains, grabbing onto whatever floating debris he could reach to try and steady himself. Seeing the way Pain dodged though dredged up something in the blonde's mind, from the rarely touched section belonging to Yagura's memories. However, as he prepared to use a technique known to most Junin shinobi, the body flicker, he noticed how far this technique had begun to reach in its hunger. He watched with mounting horror as roof tiles on the buildings in the outskirts of Konoha began to wobble and shake before violently being plucked from their perches, the actual stonework and masonry not far behind as it too began to crack and break apart. It quickly dawned on Naruto that he would not be the only one affected by this monstrosity of a jutsu, but if Pain's claims were true then it could grow to unbelievable sizes, possibly taking the entirety of Konoha with it. With that, Naruto's eyes hardened, his features set in a cold mask of determination as he turned his body towards the growing second moon. Running from this was not an option, he had to destroy it by whatever means he could. He stopped struggling, actually propelling himself towards the earthen mass so he could halt it before it grew too dangerous. He grunted as his feet touched down on the strange body, fighting down his nausea at the conflicting feelings he was getting of being pulled between the technique and the earth. He pulled chakra in his arm to an almost ludicrous degree, reaching a point where soon it would scold him for being reckless. Arg! With a great cry of effort the blonde crashed his chakra-enhanced fist straight into the ground, causing a tremendous shock wave of displaced air to ripple outwards, actually diverting a few of the incoming slabs of rock and earth. His eyes widened when the entire spherical mass shook, large cracks breaking out over its surface, only for it to shortly stop. A moment later and the entire planetary mass just seemed to shudder as Naruto realized with irritation all he had done was help loosen the ground so it could become denser in turn. Already Naruto was having to reinforce his legs against the massive pull that threatened to crush his body. The gravity was a lot more concentrated than the Earth's pull after all. The monk's eyes widened in sudden surprise as an ominously large shadow fell across his body. Pain watched with some satisfaction as a particularly large chunk of earth crashed into the growing body of rock right on the spot his opponent had been desperately trying to destroy it. He was about ready to cancel the technique, not wanting to K the Jinchuriki, when he noticed that something was wrong, a frown appearing over his face. Instead of the expected crash he had been waiting for, the chunk of earth just seemed to meld with the Chibaku Tensei. He quickly realized why when the rock had been converted into parted, revealing a head of spiky blonde hair. Naruto grimaced as he pulled himself out of the sand that was quickly growing more and more dense, stealing away his control over it. It was a pretty idiotic move, but it had been more on reflex than anything. He certainly knew he didn't want to try and control the entire floating mass this way. The only thing worse than being stuck in a floating, heavy sphere of rock would be being stuck on a floating, heavier sphere of tightly compressed sand he would be completely unable to move his body in, even with his impressive control of it. There would be no destroying it then as the sand would only absorb impacts. He shook the sand out of his hair before reaffirming his features. Already the wave of destruction rippling out from the floating sphere was making its way through the village. It was merciless and completely indiscriminate in its destruction, tearing through houses and streets, stone and metal, plants and glass alike. The monk tore himself out of the sand, gritting his teeth as much thicker than normal chains burst from his back, flying through long, curving roots as he stretched them out further than he had ever really tried before. The thick silvery chains eventually wrapped around the entirety of the still-growing sphere, like some kind of strange ribbon on a large earthen present. However, the exertion of stretching the manifestations of his chakra that far has small rivulets of sweat dripping from his brow. Jigedu, Kusurg Kusuri. The chains seemed to pulse once before constricting, digging in deep and scarring the dense orb even as they were covered up by more and more debris being piled on. Shakily, still maintaining his control, the blonde raised a hand, allowing another thick chain to fly forward, embedding itself deep in the ground below them. With visible effort in the bulging of his chakra-enhanced muscles, Naruto began to drag himself forward, taking the enormous sphere with him. However, a moment later the chain snapped back, wrenched from the ground. When Naruto looked down he only saw the grim face of Pain looking right back up at him. A new flash of anger and determination filled the blonde as he whispered a silent apology to his tenant, going perfectly still. A shadow clone burst into corporeal form beside him, catching a large slab of rock that had been heading towards them and using it as a makeshift shield against more debris piling on top. However, it quickly became apparent the exertion of holding back such weight against such a strong gravitational force was too much. The clone dropped to anew, its hair slowly drenching with sweat and the veins in its arms and end pushing against its skin. All the while Naruto stayed perfectly still as he sought out the natural energies of the world amidst the storm of rock and earth. Naruto, stop this. It will only result in your death. I have no idea how my energies within you will react to the Senjutsu chakra. Naruto's face though remained serene, calm, resigned. It doesn't matter anymore. If I wait any longer hundreds will s because of this technique, all because of me. Even if it gives me just 10 seconds I can at least try. Kurama growled lowly, frustrated and angry at being ignored. He was unable to understand why the human was doing this to himself. They aren't worth your life, you are more important than them. Naruto let out a small internal chuckle that sounded almost sad, making sure externally his body didn't move. It's like you don't know me at all, Kurama. Again, another growl L from the fox's tea as it poured down within the seal. You promised that girl you would return to her. Kurama was sure the idea of abandoning Fu would at least give Naruto pause, and he was becoming desperate, already feeling the tentative strands of the powerful foreign energy brush against Naruto's coils. However, to his surprise, Naruto only let out a small, regretful sigh as he worked to welcome the energy, harmonizing his body with it. I love Fu, but she will understand. With that statement, Kurama went quiet, unable to think of anything to say. Not that it would have mattered at this point. It was already too late. Glowing, golden Rinnegan eyes snapped open and the entire sphere, now almost a kilometer across, shuddered. Slowly Naruto spread out his hand, feeling his chakra mold as easily as ever, the unrestrained energy of the world using his body as a conduit for its power. Then, Suddenly and without warning, he closed it again. Kenkiona Jibun. Pain decided to wait this time as he saw the visage of his blonde opponent vanish beneath a few tens of feet of rubble, stone and various masonry. Behind him, Konoha continued to get torn up and fell apart to fuel the monstrosity hanging in the air as though it was a part of some great play set, hanging from invisible strings attached to the sky. In truth, the self-proclaimed god had never used the technique to this extent before, and the fact the Kyubi Jinchuriki would warrant its use without even drawing into the beast's power was staggering. Despite all his claims though, Pain could not keep this technique going on like this, and he knew it would naturally come to a conclusion before the majority of Konoha was threatened. That was why the first icy tendrils of worry had begun to infect the Rinnegan user's mind as he saw Naruto struggle against the technique with varying levels of success. Had the blonde simply found some way to outlast the growing body, or even worse, accidentally destroyed its core in his desperate flailing, it might have proven disastrous for him. The technique was trying for a Megacore's ruler, and right now even the one surviving body of his six paths technique was operating with less than satisfactory efficiency. He paid it no mind then when the sphere shuddered once. They were still just the blind groping of a being that had not yet accepted its fate in the face of a god. Even as he began to notice that some of the debris flying towards the sphere didn't quite make it, instead suddenly falling towards the ground as it got close, he passed it off as the technique slowly losing strength. However, as Tendu began to feel his body becoming heavier, and the ground around him that was directly beneath the miniature moon stopped rising up, he finally took notice. When he looked up, he didn't do what one might have expected him to do in a situation like this. He didn't look shocked, or fearful, or surprised, or even blink. He simply stared up as the enormous kilometer-wide sphere of dense, gravity-compacted stone and rock fell from the sky, rushing towards him with all the strength and power of a meteor. Just a brief moment before the impossible mass crushed him, the very smallest hints of an amused smile flickered across the puppet's face, then, nothing. Jiraiya found himself running much faster than he had in a long while. Since he had learned that his prized student had fallen in battle with the Kyubi, and he had rushed back to the village. In fact, everyone in Konoha had seen the enormous sphere slowly form just outside of the village before it slowly began to encroach on their home. However, where others had stood petrified in shock or fear or even simple awe, Jiraiya had immediately taken action. Not only was something of this magnitude beyond anybody else in this village besides Tsunade at this point, but as it reached its zenith, Jiraiya had felt the distinct feeling of a fellow sage tapping into the potent energies of the world. It was the reason Jiraiya was running with his hands clasped firmly together, a grim expression on his face as he focused his chakra delicately in preparation for summoning the two elder toads of Myobokuzen. They wouldn't be happy, but when they realized it was another sage Jiraiya might be about to fight, they would certainly understand, he hoped. However, that concentration was instantly shattered as the great earthen sphere actually fell from the sky, accelerating downwards. The old sage wasted absolutely no time, he rushing through hand seals like there was no tomorrow, which if he failed there might not have been, at least for Konoha. A lot of luck went into how little damage the village took from being crushed under a veritable tsunami of debris and rubble from the resulting impact of the kilometer-wide sphere impacting with the earth at staggering speed. For one, the gentle slope of the side of the Hokage mountain did a lot to divert the brunt of the destructive wave. Second, Konoha was built in a vaguely circular shape, so the rubble that did meet the edge of the wall was somewhat shunted and only a few houses and streets were crushed. However, praises would be sung of Jiraiya and the enormous toad Gameiken, who had used his equally large shield to take the major brunt of the impact. When the smoke cleared and the dust settled, though, it became abundantly clear that the landscape of Konoha had been irrevocably changed. A field of rubble and broken, shattered stone lay to the southern edge of the shinobi village, and the Hokage mountain had seemed to become a little smaller than the white-haired pervert remembered. That mattered little though, as Jiraiya could still feel the presence of the other sage. He hopped off Gameiken's back after a quick thanks to the thoroughly confused toad before dashing across the now barren section of what had once been forest, once again building up his chakra to summon the two elders. Once again though, he was disrupted as he saw movement amongst the earth and stone. A moment later and there was a muffled grunt of exertion as a blonde mop of spiky, ponytailed hair burst from the ground, the monk looking somewhat annoyed as he hefted a particularly large boulder off his body with the ease Jiraiya would have expected from Tsunade. For a moment the toad sage looked on in shock, the two elders forgotten as Naruto brushed himself off almost casually, checking to see if the bell in his hair had survived the descent. Naruto. Of course Jiraiya eventually overcame his shock, blinking in confusion at the young monk that was covered in dust. A moment later though and the dirt covering his body seemed to just float off him, becoming granular like sand with a simple motion of the boy's wrist. There would be no fixing the boy's torn robes with the same ease though. The monk looked up, smiling at the older sage as he finished pulling himself out of the boulders and rubble created in the impact. One moment please Jiraiya-san. The teen held up a finger, stumping the white-haired man as the boy looked around for a few moments before flickering in an unmistakable body flicker. Jiraiya was about to take off after him when he returned not a moment later, now holding his shakuju in hand which had surprisingly survived the impact without so much as a dent. What's going on here? What happened to your seal? Where is the invader? What was that technique just now? How are you even alive? The rapid stream of questions from the befuddled man gave Naruto an opportunity to walk closer, desperately hiding the pain he was in. Doton chakra, his Asura path and a healthy dose of nature chakra only went so far in reinforcing his body when he had a front row seat to a meteor strike. After a moment Jiraiya finally took notice of something he had ignored in his surprise, gawking even more. Is that you who is currently using senjutsu? Naruto wasn't sure why he was all that surprised that the man knew about the sage arts. All the opponents he had fought with it seemed to know anyway. Give me a moment to gain my bearings first please Jiraiya. The toad sage nodded reluctantly but in that brief moment when he let his guard down Naruto lashed out, tapping the man firmly on the sea with the end of the staff. In an instant Jiraiya found his ability to both mold his chakra and move his body stolen away in an instant. Somewhere back in Konoha Gameken suddenly puffed out of existence. Good, now we can talk, at least for a short while, there are still things to do. Jiraiya frowned but quickly realized he could still speak despite whatever had been done to him. What did you just do? Naruto sighed, cracking his N as he sat down on a nearby boulder, very much conscious that he didn't have a lot of time to speak. It's not very nice having your chakra taken away against your will, is it? Jiraiya narrowed his eyes for a moment before letting out an all too reluctant sigh. Point taken kid, now can you undo this? Naruto looked up for a moment and contrary to his usual nature decided to act just a little childish for once. Pain was dealt with, or at least the puppet bee he operated through, obviously for some important reason. It will wear off in a few hours. Jiraiya's face grew serious at the flippant answer as the older sage attempted to flex his chakra and break whatever it was that was suppressing him to no avail. This is no time for jokes Naruto. The white-haired man was surprised then when Naruto's own expression darkened, gaining years that didn't belong there and subconsciously making the older man cringe slightly, not that he physically could. I agree, but there is also a point to be proven. I knew about the leader of the Akatsuki, I knew about his Rinnegan. In fact I was on my way to Omegakure to deal with the issue myself when Konoha decided that my safety was suddenly their concern. Again Jiraiya would have flinched from the icy tone in the blonde's voice if he could. Many lives could have been prevented from today. With that last saddened statement Naruto got up and walked away, leaving Jiraiya alone to fruitlessly struggle against his invisible bonds and ponder the monk's words. Kurama, what's going on in there? What's the damage? He was curious to know as ever since he had entered sage mode he had felt no ill effects. When the silence within his mind went on for a little too long he tried again. Kurama. A long, withdrawn sigh was his answer, making him almost pause for a moment in confusion. Naruto, I am sorry. This time Naruto did pause, in fact he nearly fell over at the sudden apology before walking on more briskly, waiting for an explanation. I didn't know, when you took in the nature energy it calmed my chakra somehow. Right now it is no more dangerous to you than your own chakra. Naruto's face darkened momentarily, understanding the apology all of a sudden. If Naruto had entered sage mode earlier he wouldn't have been at risk and he could have possibly ended the conflict much earlier, saving many lives. After a moment though a long breath escaped his lips before he continued on, his senses spread out for what he was looking for. It is fine Kurama, you didn't know. Anyway, if I had used senjutsu that early maybe Pain would have used that technique in the middle of the village. Who know how many lives could have been lost then. Naruto knew the old fox didn't actually care about the loss of human life, he had accepted that the Bayou couldn't be changed so quickly. However, it at least showed that the creature respected the blonde enough to at least try to empathize, however insincere it was. Momentarily Naruto wondered just what he had done to leap up to this level in the fox's eyes, but he wasn't complaining. A few moments later and Naruto found what he was looking for in the half-crushed body of the last of Pain's puppets, his torso sticking up out of the rocks. Hesitantly, in case it was a trap, Naruto removed one of the chakra receivers from the corpse's arm before shaking the bee off with a grimace. He got a good feel for the chakra with his sage-enhanced sense before crushing the small black rod, following the path the chakra took until his eyes rested on a particularly large hill. He supposed it only made sense to be somewhere high when transmitting signals, and with a look of determination he set off. The blonde had a few images in his head of what to expect of Pain. A desiccated, red-haired man strapped into a machine that looked like it was the only thing keeping him alive was not one of them. The two Rinnegan users stared at one another, in person, for the first time, and for a while both were silent. One was sizing the other up, trying to glimpse their intentions while wondering why they weren't S yet. The other was simply taking in their fellow Dujutsu bearer, wondering if somehow this was what they could have become. You weren't exactly what I was expecting. Naruto's voice finally broke the painfully deafening silence, snapping Pain out of his thoughtful trance, their eyes still firmly glued on one another. I could very well say the same thing. Pain's voice, his real voice, was raspy but deep, and Naruto imagined had his body not been in such a frail, fragile state it would have been incredibly imposing, like it was through the puppets he used. So what now, Naruto Uzumaki, do you me? Naruto's hand slowly opened and closed, balling into a fist before relaxing over and over. I don't know. In truth, Naruto wasn't sure what he had been thinking. He had no idea of what he was going to do or say when he finally met the other Rinnegan user in person. The answer seemed to surprise Pain as well, and once again the two were in silence. What is your name? Pain looked up, his eyebrows slightly raised at the odd question. My name? He had not been asked his name in such a long time. Even Conan had long since given up trying to call him anything other than Pain. Nagato. Naruto closed his eyes for a moment, and Nagato considered firing the chakra rod hidden inside his walking machine, but stayed his hand for a reason he himself wasn't entirely sure of. He didn't expect it would have done much anyway. Nagato, I guess I just wanted to meet you, to try and understand how all of this happened, how you became this way. A dry, short laugh escaped the self-proclaimed god's lips. It rattled the many long chakra receivers that were stuck into his back like some gruesome impersonation of a hedgehog. Understanding is pointless, unless you share pain. That is the only way for two humans to truly understand one another. Naruto frowned, his hand still unconsciously flexing as he stood there. But why does it have to be that way? Why can't mankind understand one another through positive emotions? A shared understanding of the love as opposed to the loss, the happiness as opposed to the misery. Nagato regarded the young idealistic boy for a while, seeing so much of his friend in the boy that it was almost painful. You are naive, mankind will always know pain, it is the only common ground between us all. You cannot understand if you have never felt it, but the greed and selfishness of those who have only suffered superficially will always lead to the greater misery of others. That is why people need to understand great hardship equally. Naruto frowned again before stepping forward. Help me understand. Nagato couldn't question what Naruto meant before the blonde walked over quickly, grabbing the redhead's hand and pulling it out of the machine before he could utter so much as a protest. Show me your pain, Nagato. With that, the blonde placed his hand over Nagato's forehead while doing the same with the other Rinnegan user's hand on his own. Human path. Naruto smiled brightly as his father bounced him up and down on his knee, happily giggling to himself while his mother watched on from nearby, a light smile on her face as she saw the two play with each other. Car-san, Car-san. The woman walked over, bending over for her son with that same warm, comforting smile that always made Naruto feel better. Yes, my little Na-chan. Naruto just giggled and reached out to touch his mother's hair. He always loved the bright red color of it, even if the other kids in the village said it was a weird color. It made him feel like he belonged because it was the same color as his own. It was a sign of his family, that warm place that he could always return to. His mother just smiled softly, his father still bouncing him on his knee, and Naruto knew this was where he would always be happy. Nagato grinned brightly as another bowl of steaming ramen was placed in front of him, just awaiting the fate of the 6 others that were stacked messily to the side. He looked up with that same eating smile as he placed his hands together, nodding comically with his chopsticks eagerly clasped in his hands. Itadakimasu. The girl behind the counter of the little ramen shop giggled into her hand as the boy wolfed away at the food like he had never had a meal in his life. Slow down, Naru-kun. Nagato looked up, cute confusion over his face as a single noodle dangled from the corner of his mouth. Ayami reached over and wiped some sauce off his chin, making the young boy look away with a blush blooming brightly over his cheeks. Thanks, Nei-chan. The girl just waved it off as she picked up the latest of Nagato's conquests, taking it into the back of the shop. For a moment Nagato just watched her go, recollecting the short months it had been since he found the little stand and they welcomed him in. He wondered if this was what having a family felt like. Naruto trembled in fear, back pressed against the small cabinet next to the shattered remains of the vase he had knocked down. In front of him he heard his mother utter the last words she would ever say, telling him to run. Lightning flashed outside and he caught sight of the stylized leaf symbol on the man's forehead protector, the man who had his kunai buried in his mother's sea. He felt the tears slide down his cheeks as the two shinobi walked closer, saying something that was drowned out in the maelstrom of his own thoughts. One emotion stood out above all the others, above the fear and the sadness, the shock and the nausea, anger. A blind, boiling rage yelled forth from the back of his mind as he screamed out his fury. Then he knew nothing. Nagato felt his hands shaking as he looked down at his bee-soaked fingers, covered in Ayami's bee. He looked up, the imprint of those three black tomo on a red background forever imprinted in his memory as the two shinobi approached him, one with their kunai raised. His hand stopped trembling even as his nose was filled with the tangy scent of bee, and for a moment he experienced a strange calm in his mind before it gave way to a white-hot, burning rage. A feeling of intense heat and energy welled up inside of him, like in pressure that was screaming to be released, so he just let it all out. Then he knew nothing. Naruto flinched as the door was in his face, rain falling down on him and soaking him through to the bone with only his thin clothing to protect him. At least this house had actually bothered to open the door for him, the others had simply called out from behind the doors or from windows. His stomach growled pitifully and he did his best to ignore it, but he just felt so weak, so hungry. He forced his tired, aching legs to go on, to walk those small steps to the next house, hoping he would find more luck there. That hope was fleeting at best. Nagato ran down the streets, trying to keep his eyes on the dusty ground of one of Konoha's bustling streets. On either side of him he could practically feel the glares and harsh looks of the passers-by. He felt something warm on his face and brought a hand up to wipe it off, only to be confused when he found tears. He shook his head, wiping away the rest of them with his forearm as he ran on. He would show them, he would make them stop looking at him like that, like he wasn't even human. He would prove his existence to them somehow. Naruto looked on warily as Yahiko spoke to the three ninja. Conan stood beside him looking just as nervous. He fidgeted, looking down so that his hair covered his eyes like he had become so used to doing. When Yahiko came back, though, one of the ninja had actually come with him. He was tall with long spiky white hair. Naruto could practically feel the power radiate off him and knew this man could easily get rid of them with a flick of his wrist, like the black-haired one that looked like a snake had suggested. However, when he managed to work up the courage to look up, he only saw the man giving him a cheesy smile. Naruto wasn't even sure why he smiled back. It was like such a look just couldn't have gone unanswered. It was a small, pathetic smile, but it was still a smile. Nagato trailed behind the elderly monk, shooting not so subtle glances out of the simple windows they passed. He saw various monks going about the day, a few even looked around and saw him, making him avert his gaze. He stopped when he realized Chukaku had stopped in front of him, the elderly man looking around at him with a mirth-filled smile. Slowly the man extended his hand and after a long moment of hesitation Nagato tentatively took it, returning the smile weakly. The hand was warm, it felt nice, and Nagato felt a tiny sliver of the burden on his heart lighten. Naruto's eyes became wide, his heart practically stopping as he heard felt warm liquid drip down his hands. It was so sudden, so fast, he hadn't even known what was going on before Yahiko had crossed the distance between them, letting the kunai in Naruto's shaking hands bury itself into his body. Keep on living, together with Conan. Yahiko's last words echoed in his mind as his friend finally slumped to the side, the light leaving his eyes and a smile on his face. Nagato stood there trembling for another few moments before an old, familiar sensation welled up inside of him. His hand clenched once as his mind became clouded by a primal, burning rage. His ringed, steel-gray eyes became em as he raised his hand up at the oncoming wall of steel. Shinra Tensei. Nagato froze as Shizuku leaned up and wiped off the tear that had been clutching onto his cheek. Her warm bee was covering his hands and he could do nothing to stop it. All the power he had and it was just useless. Please don't cry. His breath hitched as Shizuku gave him the best smile she could manage, bee still dripping from the corner of her mouth. Then Nagato watched in agonizing clarity as the light slowly left her beautiful violet eyes. Everything else became muffled as the image was permanently burned into his memory thanks to his Rinnegan. Absently he felt the hundreds of kunai being thrown his way and just didn't find it in him to care. He didn't, until he found his apathy being replaced. The emptiness he felt began to fill with anger, rage, fury. He lifted an arm quickly towards the oncoming barrage of weapons and uttered a single phrase under his breath. Shinra Tensei. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.